Welcome to another episode of the Great Retention. I am so excited for you to be joining us, Demetris. So thank you so much for carving out time and just being willing to share all about your experience leading the DE&I strategy at GitHub. But thank you and welcome today.
No, thank you so much, John, for having me here. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's dive in. And I think most folks probably know about GitHub, but for those who don't, give us a quick flyover, about the organization, but also for what you're focused on and managing from a leadership perspective, number of employees. I know you mentioned remote first, but give our audience just a little bit of overview about GitHub and your role and what that looks like.
Sure. In its simplest terms, GitHub is a platform for developers by developers. We have about 100 million developers on GitHub. 90 of the Fortune 100 are customers. And we basically provide the platform for developers to accelerate human progress. We draw on our own experiences using GitHub to build GitHub. We have 3.5 billion total contributions. That's the amount of code that's on our platform in and of itself. And so we have about a little under 2,000 employees. We are a remote first company, meaning that we're remote by default. We did have about 5 or 6 offices around the world, but in the last few months, our CEO made the announcement that we're closing all of our offices. So we will be 100% remote really shortly. And so when the pandemic hit and a lot of people were, trying to figure out how does this remote thing work, we were already doing it. This is natural to us. This is a part of our culture. And so that's one of the things that makes us truly be the home for all developers, because we have people all around the world that are helping us here internally to build that platform for developers.
Wow, you were ahead of the game for sure. So around 2,000 employees all around the world, 100% remote. And so tell us a little bit about, your leadership role leading the DE&I strategy for GitHub, but also, talk to us a little bit about the culture at GitHub. The develop. I mean, I think, maybe for folks who aren't, coders and developers, what they may think, what that culture might be, but talk to us a little bit about that and talk to us a little bit about how the DE&I strategy supports that culture, influences that culture, leads that culture. So that would be really, really helpful to learn too.
That's a lot packed into one.
Yeah, I know. I just gave you a lot there.
So as the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at GitHub, my role is to create a cohesive strategy that aligns across our 4 pillars. We call them the 4 Ps. That's people, which is our HR, that's traditional diversity and inclusion that everyone's familiar with. But we also have it embedded across our social impact, which is our philanthropy, our policy, and our platform, as I mentioned, just encompasses over 100 million developers. And so we have amazing leaders that leads the body of work across all of those 4 Ps. But I tend to lean my efforts more around increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion on our platform. This is something that I felt that if you start influencing diversity, equity, and inclusion across a platform of 100 million people, that's when you start seeing generational shifts. That's when you start making like a huge impact, even beyond the 4 walls of your company. Speaking of the 4 walls, you asked about culture. And I want to take a step back first and just say, how do I define culture? So in its most simplistic terms, I always say that culture is like the vibe of the company. It's the pulse. It's that secret sauce that makes the company unique. It's not this thing that you can actually touch. I say it's embedded in every single thing you do, from the walls to the halls to the people and to the processes. I think I like these P's a lot, right?
Yeah, I love it.
And some of the things that I say is necessary for building a strong culture, I would say the number one thing is just trust. Like I say, trust, you have to have it. And it's trust from a couple of different perspectives. From the employee perspective, employees have to trust that this system, this culture that they're walking into, that it's going to take care of them, that it's going to, make them feel like they belong. They're going to get meaningful work and opportunities to contribute. And most importantly, that the culture is going to be so that they have the tools that they need to succeed and thrive. Now, on the flip side of this, and this is that practical that you were asking about,
Yeah.
leadership has to trust the culture too. They have to trust that the culture that they created, like it also has an environment where employees can do the best work of their lives because they have to be able to produce maximum results for customers and shareholders. We've seen tons of times amazing companies that have this culture. Everybody loves to come to work, it's fun and all those things. But then the next thing you know, it goes bankrupt because they
Right.
were having fun at work. The culture was amazing, but they weren't doing the things that they needed to do to keep the lights on. So
Yeah.
that system of that culture, it has to be that balance there where employees can trust it as well as the employer can trust it so that they're actually both getting what they need.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point. And, I don't think that I know a lot of leaders I talk to. I understand the importance around trust, but I haven't heard it necessarily with the leaders have to trust it as well, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's a really interesting point because if that's not there, I think it's hard for the employee to have that feel that trust as well. I mean, it's I know that if I'm not authentic, it people pick up on that right away, right?
Oh,
And authentic, that comes, I think, from me trusting in what we've built in this team and this culture. And so I think that's a really interesting point. And then the other thing, Demetris, that you shared, so the four P's, so people, platform, philanthropy, social impact, and policy.
mhm.
But you're leaning on platform, right? And this is what I think of in terms of just scaling, the potential impact, right, that you can have. And we all as leaders have a platform, our organizations have a platform, but I think a lot of times we may not even be thinking about it that way. We're thinking about it, hey, like maybe for my team, which by the way, you've got 2,000 employees. I mean, that's a good sized team, right? But over 100 million, people in the platform, right? And so it's just a different scale. So I think that's really interesting about, for even me, right? Just challenging my thinking, right? How do I think bigger in terms of the impact that I can make? So I love that, and I want to take it a step further. So talk to us about, how have you leaned into this platform when it comes to your DE&I strategy, right? Talk to us a little bit about maybe some examples. Help us understand what that looks like.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One was just with the creation of the DEI strategy. So when I came to GitHub, they said, "Oh, we need you to go and create this strategy." And so I was thinking, how it's been, in other companies that I might have joined, that nothing was being done, that I would have to spin up all these things like it was net news, this introduction. But when I
Mhm.
came into GitHub and I did an assessment, the first thing that I noticed was they were already doing the work. The work was already being done. It just wasn't labeled in, typical diversity, equity, and inclusion terminology. And
Okay.
so the only thing I did was just repackage it in a strategy so that everyone knew that. I always say this, and I kind of say it tongue in cheek. I say, if I go into an organization and I do my job well, I should actually talk myself out of a job. I should work myself out of a job. GitHub, I am happy with my job. This is not me. I still got work to do, so don't take it too far.
Okay. Okay.
But what the reason why I say that is that it should come to life in everything that everyone does around the company. And so when I say that we centered the platform, I think it's important for companies to center their diversity, equity, and inclusion to the core mission of who they are. And so at GitHub, our commitment was to be the home for all developers. And the first thing that I said was, you can't be the home for all developers if you're not diverse, if you're not inclusive. So
Right.
the first thing I did was centered our platform so that when you look at the picture that we have for the four P's, it's almost like I called it a helicopter propeller. The platform is in the middle, and then you have those other three P's centered around it. So that when we're making decisions about what we should be doing, the products and services we should be launching, the demographics that we should be serving, the policy that we should be thinking about, the causes that we should be supporting with our philanthropy, it has to come back to that center, to that platform. And
Mm.
so that's one of the things that we did was just making sure that what we do is aligned to our mission. And I think that's a key takeaway that many companies could look at. I
Yep.
see so
I
many
like that.
companies trying to be something that they're not in the name of diversity and inclusion. You have tech companies spinning up universities and things like that. You know what I mean? Their own version
Yeah.
of it. they're not education companies. And so that's where you see a lot of failed efforts, or I shouldn't even say failed. It's just lots of resources that are expended with not the maximum impact that could be had if you partner with the right people that's what they do on a daily basis. And so one of the things that I've done is created a program or actually a community called All In. And the object of All In is to open source diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's to bring stakeholders from all across the industry to come to the table and do what they do best. We have the platform, we have the communities. And so now what we're doing is partnering with organizations that do other things well, and we're bringing the people to them. And so that's the way we look at it with, open source and diversity and inclusion. We're not working on the strategy by ourselves. We have philanthropists, we have foundations, we have other companies
Yeah.
who are competitors to each other. We have the university system. We have other key leaders across the industry that are all working together collectively on this initiative.
Yeah, it's so it's so interesting what you're saying, Demetri. So it's open source DE&I strategy, right?
Mhm.
And what I love about that is probably for whatever reason, maybe there's this sense like we got to like go at it alone, or we've got to figure everything out, but the truth is that there's a lot we can learn from other leaders, other organizations. And if we can open that up, right, open source, I mean, wow, you can just you can significantly grow the impact that you're having, and using your platform, aligning it back to your the mission of GitHub being an open source platform. I love that. And it actually makes me it goes so well with just why we do this podcast, right? We want to open source
Right.
people first, people centric ideas and leaders, so that they can help other leaders be more proactive with their teams. So love the concept. I think that's a huge lessons learned that any leader can take is, hey, how do I open source these things that are working, and how do I learn and bring in other what's working in other places, so that we can have the greatest impact possible. But to your point, it needs to be aligned back to our mission as an organization, right? Otherwise we will maybe spend some resources and not have the greatest impact. So love that. So okay, so and give us a little bit of a little more context. So how long have you has GitHub been kind of on this open source DE&I strategy, and what's maybe some of the impact or the results that you've seen so far?
Sure. So we launched All In, which is the name of the program, All
Okay.
In 2021. So a little over 2 years now, and I can't even believe that.
I
The
know.
first thing, the first thing we did was we had to understand where we were. There was some data that was out there, very minimal data that people had gleaned from a survey. And it was just focused on gender, how many women were in the industry. And that's about it. So we
Okay.
couldn't even hold ourselves accountable or even know the progress we made or progress we still needed to make until we had data. And so the first thing we did was author a survey, the most comprehensive survey ever done, DEI across the entire open source ecosystem. And it's important that I call that out because with a platform of 100 million developers, it's easy for us to run a survey, right? And get a
Right.
very good representative sample. But one of the things that I pointed out quickly was GitHub is a major player in the open source ecosystem, but we're not the only player. There's so many other places where people find community, other platforms, and if we're truly serious about making a difference across the entire industry, we can't just keep that to ourselves. It's exactly the
Yeah.
same point we were just making around open
Yep.
sourcing it. And so we partner with the Linux Foundation, which kind of sits in that kind of, that centralized place, even in a way that we can't do. And we partnered with them to run the survey. And through that survey, we captured over 7,000 voices. We had over 7,000 people. We actually had over 12,000 people that responded to it, but 7,000 were the ones that completed it and gave us the qualified, responses that we needed.
Wow.
And so that gave us a lot of indication. And that's open source. We open sourced the questions. We made it so that if anybody wants to run this same survey in their individual communities, that they could. So we had that. The second thing we did was realize quickly from the survey is that maintainers are, some of the most influential people when it comes to influencing diversity and inclusion within open source. So maintainers to an open source community is like the manager to a team. And so what I
Okay.
always say is that you can create so many amazing corporate, trainings and require people to go to training every year and all these, privilege and unconscious bias trainings. But if your employees take those trainings and they go back to their, day to day in their team and it's not an inclusive environment, then those trainings don't mean anything. And
Right.
it's that manager that really sets that tone and that culture of those day to day interactions. That's exactly what a maintainer does for a community. So we realized that that's where we really needed to start. And I said, well, before we start there, we have to hear from them. We have this saying at GitHub is that we create and build diversity and inclusion with hubbers, not for hubbers. And so we said we needed to do the same thing for maintainers. We need to build something with them, not for them. And
Mm.
so we embarked on a maintainers listening tour. Interviews, individual interviews. We had in-person focus groups, virtual focus groups. We had an online forum for anybody that couldn't make it to both of those. We heard from over 300 maintainers on what's working, what's not working, what are the
Mhm.
gaps, what are the challenges, what would they like to see in a program that's there to support them with creating an inclusive environment within their community. And from that, we were able to launch All In for Maintainers, which is a whole series of initiatives and programs specifically for maintainers. And then the last, and certainly not least piece, because this is the one that I talk about the most, we launched All In for Students. And All In for Students was giving students an opportunity to be exposed to open source and to learn about open source. What we found is that there were still a lot of barriers with people of color, especially those that attended minority serving institutions here in the US. And we're talking your historically Black colleges and universities, your Hispanic serving institutions, women's colleges, and even community colleges. And so we
Mm.
started with a pilot last year, 30 students. We gave them technical training. We gave them an introduction to open source, just learning the language and the vocabulary. They
Yeah.
had to complete a technical project with our partner, Major League Hacking. And we also gave them career development, professional development, because we all know that the tech industry is a different industry. So we can teach
Yep.
you those technical skills, but if you don't know all of those things what do you do when you're the only one on the team? How
Mm.
do you give, and get really good feedback? How do you negotiate your offer? How do you leverage employee resource groups? All of those things that, quite frankly, we all wish we had known when we first started out. So we
Yeah.
did all of that, and the goal was to get these students prepared for an internship with our corporate partners. These were, Fidelity, Microsoft, Cisco, Intel, Red Hat, and I feel like I'm missing one here, and I'll come back to that one.
That's
But
okay.
the whole goal, these were companies that were not looking at these students. They were not going to these schools. And
Mm.
every student that completed that pilot, they went on to get a internship at one of these top leading companies that they would never have been given that opportunity. And so over half of our students received internship offers for the next summer. Several of them received full-time employment opportunities. There was one student that we had that said that they never thought they could be a developer because their computer science department really didn't offer a lot of programming classes. Through All In, he was able to switch his summer internship from being a project manager to in project management to software development. And he's now a full-time software developer at his employer,
Wow.
upon graduation. And so those are some of the success stories that we saw just during the pilot. And this year, we said we got to scale. Like we did a nice 30-person pilot because we wanted to be thoughtful about how we built it.
Yeah.
Our goal was this year to scale it by 10x to 300 students. We actually have 405 students in the program.
Wow. Okay.
Um, 112 universities represented. I think about 75% of the students attended, exactly what I just said, an HBCU, Hispanic Serving Institution, or community college. So we're seeing so much amazing progress in that. We're seeing students that are changing majors because we did open it up to all majors. We're seeing community college students that's going on and, going to 4-year universities. We're seeing boot camps. Over half of our students participated in their first hackathon ever. Really just having an expansive view for, providing access to those who've kind of been left behind a little bit in open source.
Yeah, no, I love the stories and the just the journeys that have been impacted in these people's lives, right? And going back, I mean, so you shared that was awesome, Demetris. So you shared some wonderful stories, but going back and you said you started with data, right? You needed to have a baseline, right? And just understanding where are we today, right? Before you can make any strategy or decisions, it's where are we today, right? And so I love how you zeroed in on that, like, hey, let's get the data, right? Because I'm thinking about like other leaders, how are they going to take this forward, right? And so, hey, let's find out where we are today, good, bad, anything in between, let's at least know, right? And then you made another point which I thought was really interesting. You say maintainers, right? But in other industries it's managers, right? And it's saying like we got to focus on our people leaders, our managers, or in your world, the maintainers, right? And so that has to be part of any strategy to be sustainable. And so I love that. And then, it's just the theme I'm getting is like, hey, we might start small with a pilot, but then it's like, how do we scale? How do we leverage this platform? And you just shared the story about starting with 30 students and now 400. So yeah, I'm just soaking it in and the stories here.
Yeah, and I have to say something, about data. Data and I, we have a complicated relationship. I think I'll
Okay.
call it that.
Okay.
Definitely need the data to just kind of set a baseline to see where you are. But I always issue and it's probably might be an unpopular opinion, but just this cautionary warning about DEI and data. So I'm just going to take and keep it in the tech industry. In tech, we're engineers. We love data. And
Yep.
part of the reason why we love data is we see the data, we can quickly analyze and see what the issues are. We can write a quick script or a solution, ship it, and then voila, we fixed it. Like, let's move on to the next thing. But I
Yep.
always tell engineers, human work doesn't work that way. And DEI is human work. I've seen
Mm,
so many people trying to do those quick fixes and those quick scripts and that quick program. And then they get one, it actually causes more harm than good. Or two, you realize it just didn't work. And so I also see a lot of DEI professionals, and I have to coach and mentor a lot of people on this, where they're calling me
mhm,
and say, my leaders keep asking me for data, and I keep giving them data, and they keep making up all these data requests. And so sometimes data and requests for data can be an amazing excuse for inaction. Because if
mm,
I can keep you chasing your tail for data on how many women left the org on a Wednesday, like, well, how many
right.
leave during the month of February? And you know what I
Right.
mean? They just want you to constantly splice the data. And it's almost like they're saying they can't get a complete picture to move and do anything until you give them. And so I'll see these scorecards that have like a million pieces of data on it and you can't glean any insight from it. And I was like, what is this really doing? And so I say, get some data so that you can make some informed decisions, get enough data, but
Yep.
you don't have to have that perfect data set in order to move. Sometimes I'll tell a leader that constantly asks me for data, I was like, you know what? I need you to do me a favor first. Your next, all hands or get together or all, org meeting that you have everybody turn their cameras on. And then I want you to look at what you see on your screen and then come back to me and tell me what you think some of the issues or opportunities you might have before you. More often than not, when a leader takes me up on that challenge, the data confirms what they're able to see just with their eyes. So I did
Mm.
not need to go spinning, and creating all these Tableau dashboards for you to see if you just take a real honest look at what you have in front of you. And so that's why I say I'll issue that
Yeah.
cautionary tale because I've seen data like, oh, so I can't do anything unless I have the data. I was like, yeah, you actually can.
That's a great point. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think that it is kind of a natural reaction to say, "Hey, we need the data," right?
Mhm.
But and which I get, I understand. I mean, you want to make informed decisions, but at the same time, it shouldn't. It's what is the like you can't analysis paralysis. It's like you can't
Mhm.
let that get in the way of moving forward,
Right.
right? And I know in the startup world, which I'm sure you know very well too. Sometimes like you gotta sometimes you gotta ship product and it's not fully baked and it's not done, and but you're moving forward and you're continuing to iterate, you're continuing to evolve, and that's part of the learning process. So I'm really glad you brought that point up. I think
Yeah.
that's a really meaningful lesson learned,
Yeah.
for this strategy.
Because if you don't have perfect data, you just have to have a really strong feedback loop.
Mm,
Like I'll go out with something and tell our employees or even people in the open source ecosystem, we are going to ship something in a couple of weeks, and I say we're piloting this. We want to know it's not perfect, but we want to know, how does this land? Is
yeah,
it solving what you needed to do? Is it causing some unintentional consequences that we don't know? We need that from you. That's part of that whole thing, building with and not for. And
yeah,
so that's one of the ways that you can do that, because a lot of times people won't ship, especially diversity and inclusion work, because we have this call out culture or this cancel culture, and that's the quickest
right,
way to get you in the news if you're having like a really bad DEI, initiative that's launched. But that's where that culture of trust comes in, that trust in the
yeah,
culture, where they trust that you have the best of intentions. You brought them along in the process and in the journey. They're not surprised by anything. And then they see themselves as a true partner with you to making it better for everyone. And so that's where, like, that I always say, you always have to have the data, but you also need that sentiment, because sometimes what people are telling you, the data just doesn't give you that complete picture. And that's why, as part of All In, we launched a survey as well as the listening tour. And that's something that I would strongly advise people to do.
this is great lessons learned, great insight here, Demetris, and so thank you so much for joining us on the show today. As we wrap up, one of the things that you've already shared, several insights that I think that people can absolutely, use and apply, to their teams. But, we always like to give a kind of a practical next step takeaway, key lesson learned. As we wrap up today, is there any particular insight that comes to mind that, you can leave our audience with that perhaps they can take back to their team organization and have impact, right away?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the number one thing is to listen to your people. Just listen. And quite honestly, that's the part of the job that most people are saying. It takes so much time, and you can't scale that if you're constantly listening. Make the time to do it. You
Mm,
cannot build an effective culture if you're not listening to your people. And it's a constant rotation. It's that strong feedback loop that I was mentioning a few moments ago. Um, I always say that my job as a DEI, leader, is to have communication just flowing throughout the entire organization. Nothing scarier to me than when an organization goes quiet. Like that actually makes me nervous. And my job is to make sure that the communication is constantly flowing.
mm,
Because you always have to keep a pulse on your people, and engagement surveys, as I just mentioned, it doesn't sometimes accurately reflect, where people are, because people's concerns a year ago is totally different than what they were 6 months ago, than
yeah,
what they're facing now. Just the industry, just the world has changed so much, and, like, think about it, 2022 what or 2020 wasn't that far ago.
yeah. But
Right? And think about
yeah, you're
all
right.
of the pandemic and well-being and burnout, the newness of a remote culture, the racial inequities and social injustice with the murder of George Floyd. You had a lot of things going on in the world
Right.
politically. Now you have, just the massive layoff. You had the great resignation, right?
Yep.
Where employees were like, employers were like really scared. Now you have all these layoffs and the economic uncertainty, and now employees, all of those things you have to make sure that your culture is such that it can adjust to all of that. And if you're not listening, you're missing some key insights. So listen, listen, listen. And then when you communicate back out what you've heard, make sure to keep it simple. In diversity and equity and inclusion, there's so much vocabulary that's
Mm,
being used for some of the things that, we've been talking about for years. They're just putting a different wrapping on it. But if you're communicating and people can't understand what you're saying because you're using new terminology, you're not doing your job very well. Like, people should be able to understand what you're saying in the simplest terms. And even me as a DEI professor, there's new terms that are coming out. It seems like every week or every month.
yeah.
I can't even keep up. And this is what I do on a day-to-day basis. So you can't expect your employees to keep up with all of those things as well. So keep it simple. This is not the time to flex your vocabulary. So listen and then communicate out what you've heard and then use that to actually build the things that you need for your employees to do the best work of their lives.
Love this. Love it so much, Demetris. Thank you again so much for just sharing your real world experience, right? So what you've learned along your journey, and I appreciate so much you being willing to share that with other leaders so that they can, that they can take this and apply and really elevate the employee experience inside of their organization. So thank you again for being part of the show today.
Thank you. And thank you for having me, John.